Before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to a very good book by Andrew J. Mitchell. It's called The Tigers of Tonkin: The History of the French Foreign Legion in Indochina, 1883 to 1945. The link will be in the description page below. Thank you for joining me and welcome to my channel. Please be advised that the following content is for a mature audience only. It deals with the Japanese coup d'etat in French Indochina on the 9th of March 1945, and it does have graphic descriptions. Despite Indochina remaining loyal to the French Vichy government, this did not mean that the French and Japanese cooperated fully during the war, and relations were at best described as strained. In September 1940, the French Foreign Legion held back the Japanese invasion of Indochina for 3 days at the strategic town of Langson in the north. Toward the end of September 1940, an agreement was reached allowing a certain number of Japanese forces to be stationed in Indochina. To prepare for an invasion of the Dutch East Indies, some 140,000 Japanese troops invaded southern Indochina on the 28th of July 1941. Occasional firefights broke out between the French and the Japanese, continuing until the beginning of 1945. The Japanese decided that the threat posed by the advancing Allies would be increased greatly if the French forces in Indochina were to switch sides. In Indochina, plans were being drawn up by the French to counter the Japanese aggression. In the 5th REI, or Régiment Étranger d'Infanterie, the legionnaires were eager to get back into the fight. The Americans had almost fully liberated the Philippines, while on the 17th of February 1945, the Americans landed on Corregidor. On the 19th of February, the Marines landed on Iwo Jima. In French Indochina, an almost unspoiled haven of peace for the world at that time, the Japanese were aware that an increasingly active resistance, supported by the British, was gaining pace. Dropping more up-to-date weapons and long-range radios to certain elements of the Legion, the Allies hoped to gain a foothold on the peninsula. Considerably reinforcing their units in Indochina, the Japanese had a significant advantage of numbers, modern weapons, and communication networks. The Kempeitai, Japanese secret police, or like the Japanese Gestapo, began a reign of terror. They planned to take all the French garrisons over within a space of 24 hours. They devised a treacherous and profoundly sinister plan to eliminate the threat posed by the French military in Indochina. This was Operation Maigo. The Japanese coup d'etat in French Indochina, known as Maigo Sakusen or Operation Bright Moon, was a Japanese operation which took place on the 9th of March 1945. In early March 1945, Japanese forces were redeployed around the main French garrison towns throughout Indochina, linked by radio to the southern area headquarters. After an ultimatum delivered to Admiral Dessous by the Japanese envoy in Saigon, Ambassador Shunichi Matsumoto, ordering the admiral to disarm and place all French forces under the Japanese control, was rejected, Operation Maigo was launched all over Indochina simultaneously. The 5th REI, the Legion's regiment in Indochina, held the garrisons at Langson, Vietri, Tong, Tonkin, and Hanoi. It was in the town of Langson where the fighting was the fiercest and some of the most terrible atrocities were committed by the Japanese forces. The Japanese staff officers laid a trap by inviting the civilian and military authorities to dinner on March the 9th at 1830. General Lemonnier, commanding the 3rd Brigade of the Tonkin Division, was at Langson. He had a little over 1,200 men under his command. He declined the invitation. However, to avoid a diplomatic incident, he allowed the Resident General Orfel, Colonel Robert, garrison commander, and his deputies Lieutenant Colonel Leroy and Chef de Bataillon Amiguet to attend. During the meal at 2000 hours, the Japanese confiscated their weapons and announced to Colonel Robert that the French garrison would be attacked at 2100 hours and asked him to give the order of non-resistance. Colonel Robert refuses, and the guests were taken prisoner. Lieutenant Colonel Amiguet and Chef de Bataillon Leroy were killed immediately. At the same time, approximately 8 to 10,000 Japanese soldiers attacked the positions of the citadel and the forts of Gallieni, Negria, and Bria des Îles. The French forces resisted fiercely. The odds were 1 against 10. Their tenacity and courage allowed the French troops to hold all night and well into the next day and beyond. A motorized detachment of 5 REI, under the command of Lieutenant Michel Duronsoy, formed part of the garrison. They participated in the defense of Langson. At 2030, the majority of the officers of the garrison out on the town or at home were kidnapped. Immediately without warning, the Japanese infiltrated the citadel. A terrible and confused close-quarter battle ensued, during which the Legionnaires' armored detachment bore the brunt of the main attack. They even managed to dislodge the enemy from buildings they already occupied. Lieutenant Duronsoy led a number of counterattacks on the Japanese by conducting strikes into the center of the enemy positions, but the counterattack was finally repelled. The Legionnaires held out at the citadel until 1500 hours the next day. Lieutenant Duronsoy, already twice wounded, rallied his remaining men and retreated to the fort Bria des Îles. Resisting throughout the night against the numerically superior Japanese forces, the Legionnaires and the Tonkin riflemen suffered from thirst, artillery bombardments, and aerial attacks, but they still held the Japanese at bay. During the afternoon, with ammunition supplies almost exhausted, the Japanese managed to gain a foothold in the fort. The defenders continued to fight in underground storage rooms until the Japanese deployed gas into the corridors and rooms. At 1800, the fighting finally ceased. Furious at the resistance encountered, the Japanese led the survivors out, then lined them up. With their hands tightly bound behind their backs, the survivors were marched onto the flat roof of the fort. When the Legionnaires saw the 3 machine guns on fixed mountings pointing in their direction, they knew what was about to happen. Dozens of Japanese soldiers stood by, waiting for the order, with bayonets fixed. Lieutenant Duronsoy stepped towards the Japanese officer in command and said, "I am the leader of the Legionnaires. I am the one responsible. They were simply following orders. Kill me, and only me." The Japanese officer raised his sword, slicing through the air inches from Lieutenant Duronsoy's head. The Japanese officer turned to his men, raising his sword once more. In a final act of defiance, Lieutenant Duronsoy began singing La Marseillaise. His Legionnaires joined in. As the Legionnaires finished the second verse, the Japanese officer brought his sword down, signaling the massacre to begin. The machine guns fired short bursts into the unarmed Legionnaires. Then the Japanese, standing to the side, rushed in, using their bayonets, rifle butts, and entrenching tools. They carried on mercilessly, killing anyone who showed signs of movement or cried out in pain. One Legionnaire survived the massacre. Legionnaire Oleksky was left for dead under the bodies of his friends. Exasperated by the heavy losses, 800 dead, the Japanese attempted to extort an order to surrender from General Lemonnier, captured on March the 10th in the evening. When he refused, he was taken with the resident General Offel to the caves of Kai Luo, near Langson, where they were to be beheaded. Here is an account by witness to the execution of General Lemonnier and Resident Offel and Colonel Robert on the 12th of March. With some other prisoners, including General Lemonnier and Resident Offel, we were led to Kailao near a rock-shaped menhir, behind which a pit was dug. Corporal Chef Sakiropoulos of the Legion, covered in bandages, was already there. The Japanese officer in command made him kneel at the edge of the pit and asked the general to sign an act of general surrender for the French forces. On his refusal, the sword fell on the neck of the corporal-chef, and his decapitated body was then pushed into a pit. It was then the turn of Resident General Orfel. Again the same question was asked. When General Lemonnier refused once more, the sword came down and the decapitated body was pushed into the pit. General Lemonnier was then knelt down by the grave and reiterated his refusal. He was then beheaded in the same way as the others. At the citadel, they had held out until the last bullet before continuing the fight at Fort Brieux-de-l'Isle. Losses on the French side were 120 people killed and 140 seriously wounded who were hospitalized. There were many more walking wounded. At the end of the battle, the Japanese began executing prisoners, except for around 100 badly wounded men, whom Dr. Clerc, who was in charge of the hospital, managed to save. On March the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th, 460 survivors and walking wounded were brought to the edge of a trench beside the Song Kai Kong River. Here they were beheaded with swords or an axe, machine-gunned and bayoneted. Survivors were finished off with a pickaxe. In total, between March the 9th and March the 13th, 1945, 1,128 French and Indo-Chinese soldiers died in the Lang Son affair. This is only a fraction of what happened that night. I have made some notes on the Legion's defense of Hanoi and the citadel there, along with other incredible acts of gallantry performed by the Legionnaires of 5 REI, leading up to the Alessandri column and the epic march to China, which I will post in the coming days. I hope you found this interesting. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and join me for the next post. Thank you. Have a good one.